All right, well, it's a bit like watching popcorn. There's always a few more kernels to go, but I think perhaps we can get kicked off so that we can use the time that we have available to us. My name is Jason Anderson. I'm Program Director at ClimateWorks Foundation, and I want to welcome all of you to this webinar entitled Global Stocktake 101, which is being hosted by the independent Global Stocktake, the iGST. ClimateWorks hosts the secretariat of the iGST, but it's a joint venture with a number of people, some of whom you'll hear from today, but with many other people around the world participating. For those of you who are not from North America, 101 may or may not be familiar. This is just the term, meaning it's an introductory class. So while I'm sure that most or all of you are familiar with the stocktake as a concept, what we're going to hear from today are experts who can talk you through what is actually the process, what are the main points of content, and how people are becoming engaged in the issue. And you can already see that we have a web link there, independentgst.org, which will connect you through to the ClimateWorks website, which has a wealth of information, including the many outputs that the iGST has put together over the past couple of years. So why don't we move forward? Let me just give you a little bit of information about the iGST. It is an independent, as the name implies, initiative of civil society actors to support the stocktake. It is not a parallel stocktake, but it is meant to provide information and influence the global stocktake. We are structured in a number of different ways. We have thematic working groups on adaptation, equity, finance, and mitigation, recognizing that the point of the stocktake revolves around the goals of Paris and not simply around mitigation. We also have regional hubs either operating or in development in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Southeast Asia, and in West Africa. So our goal is to help align the independent community with the recognition that many people from around the world are going to take interest in the stocktake. We started a couple of years ago to give a good run up to the period that we're in now, with the stocktake already having started and culminating in 2023. And then indeed, the information from that stocktake hopefully being influential and useful to countries in the period after that. So we've been using this time to pull together modelers and analysts, campaigners, advocates, all to be able to try to get the most out of this moment that the stocktake represents in the architecture of the Paris Agreement. We also recognize that there are political realities that are going to constrain the formal stocktake, and so we're hoping to complement it with independent analysis and action so that we can get the most out of this moment. Next slide. So today, we're very fortunate to have experts who are going to walk us through different aspects of this work, starting with Jamal Sarouji from the World Resources Institute, who will give an overview of the formal processes and the key issues. And after Jamal, we'll move on to Farhan Akhtar and Harold Winkler, who are co-facilitators of the Global Stocktake technical dialogues, and we'll talk more about what that is and informally what their insights are. And then we will have Marine Pouget from Climate Action Network, who will talk about the really important role that civil society has in ensuring that we have an effective stocktake. And we then should have time for questions and answers. So if there are any technical questions, you can try to chat to the hosts and panelists, and we can try to get back to you. Otherwise, just use the functions there to put in your any insights or questions along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Jamal, to kick things off.
Thank you so much, Jason. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be here. Today's webinar is indeed very timely, and I'm very excited to be part of this conversation and to talk about the global stocktake mechanism together with a terrific panel here with us today. So let us jump right in. Next slide, please. So thank you so much. So what I will do here today in the next 15 minutes is to explain what is the global stocktake, why is it important, what it covers, how will this process unfold, and talk about the necessary elements to ensure an effective outcome in 2023 when the Global Stocktake is meant to conclude. Next slide. So let us start with the question of what is the Global Stocktake? It is a 2-year process established under the Paris Agreement and is meant to assess countries' collective progress towards achieving the purpose of the agreement as a whole and its long-term goals. And here I want to stress that it will report on the collective progress, as in it will not focus on a particular country or a certain country group, but rather the efforts of all countries together. This process is central to the Paris Agreement's ratchet mechanism, where countries are expected to raise their ambition on climate change over time. And so the Global Stocktake follows a 5-year cycle, or in other words, it happens every 5 years, and it's time to inform every set of new NDCs from countries. The first ever Global Stocktake was officially kickstarted at COP26 in Glasgow back in November and will run for 2 years, culminating at COP28 in the UAE. Next slide. Now, what would an effective Global Stocktake accomplish? First, it needs to drive further ambition and ambitious action and support from countries on climate change. Thus, the Global Stocktake should inform subsequent NDCs submitted under the Paris Agreement and is meant to serve as really the engine behind driving more ambition and implementation on climate change. Second, it must also set the pace and help synchronize short-term NDCs and policies with the longer-term goals of the Paris Agreement, especially our goal to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C. Third, it must provide accountability, and accountability is key. And it can do that by fostering transparency and building momentum for action through public scrutiny from outside the process as well, not just from the inside. And then finally, it must provide guidance and signals to stakeholders by sharing best practices and lessons learned, and to have this forward-looking element, not just a backward-looking element. Now, in order to achieve these goals, countries set up this process to be comprehensive and cross-cutting in nature, and that the topics that we would cover would mirror the 3 main thematic areas of the Paris Agreement. So, next slide, I will be talking about what the Global Stocktake will cover. So as we said, the Global Stocktake is meant to assess the collective progress, and it is meant to look at issues such as mitigation, adaptation, finance flows, and means of implementation and support. Aside from these 3 thematic areas, it's very important that it considers the cross-cutting issues of response measures and loss and damage. This is what countries highlighted as a priority for the Global Stocktake to look into. Countries have also highlighted the fact that the Global Stocktake would need to be conducted in light of equity and the best available science. Now, the Global Stocktake, to conduct this assessment across the thematic and cross-cutting areas, it needs to be happening in a facilitated, open, and inclusive dialogue. And this process will be taking place across a 2-year process that is participatory in nature. Now, in order to understand a bit better on how this process unfolds, there are 3 main components for it. Those components are highlighted now on the screen. It starts with phase 1, which is shown in blue, and that's the information collection and preparation phase. This phase began at COP26, and it is meant to provide an opportunity to parties, international organizations, and non-party stakeholders to submit information necessary to take stock of progress on the Paris Agreement under its different thematic areas and cross-cutting issues. Now, as you can see in blue, this phase overlaps with the second component of the Global Stocktake, which we see now in orange, and this is the technical assessment period. This period includes a series of in-person dialogues to review all of the information received as part of phase 1, and will take place from mid-2022 to mid-2023 next year. And then finally, on the screen, you see phase 3, which is in green, and that's the consideration of outputs phase. During this phase, we will see the release of the key findings from the technical dialogue, and the technical assessment phase as a whole. And this will take place at COP28 in the United Arab Emirates. Now, this phase is meant to inform countries on updating and enhancing, in a nationally determined manner, their climate actions and support, as well as enhancing international cooperation for climate change. So these are the broad strokes of the main 3 phases. What I will do now is go into slightly more detail about the timeline and the different components of the GST and what do they include in detail. So in the case of the first global stocktake, and ahead of COP26, the UNFCCC provided a lot of guidance and information on the process and issued a call for parties, international organizations, and then non-party stakeholders to make the first round of inputs to the global stocktake. And they set a deadline of the first deadline, and that is the 28th of February, 2022. So that's happening later this month. In addition to these inputs that are being submitted by parties and international organizations and then civil society members and others, there will be a series of 13 synthesis reports conducted by the UNFCCC and constituted bodies. Those are bodies of a group of experts. They will be making 13 synthesis reports on different elements that are related to the global stocktake that will feed into this phase of information collection and preparation. And then there will also be the IPCC reports that are expected to come out in the next couple of, this month and then next month. And they are marked here in dark blue, which will also serve as the main inputs to the global stocktake. So these are the main sources of data or information that are planned to be plugged into the process. As you can see on the graphic, the submissions will continue to be accepted until early 2023. And so there will be other opportunities to make inputs based on emerging information. And basically, after, in the sense of how the technical dialogues would progress, they could highlight certain information gaps that could be identified in phase 2. And so, different parties or non-party stakeholders could help in plugging in some of these information gaps. Now, as seen, this information collection phase overlaps with the technical assessment phase, which is shown in orange. This consists of 3 technical dialogues that are going to be organized, the first one in June 2022, and then later in the year during COP27. And then the third and final technical dialogue is expected to take place next year in June 2023. During these dialogues, parties and experts and non-party stakeholders will be invited to review the inputs received under phase 1 and address the main issues to inform the next round of NDCs. These dialogues, it's really important to highlight that these dialogues must be conducted in a comprehensive and facilitated manner by being open, inclusive, and transparent. And we are privileged to hear more from the co-facilitators of the technical dialogue, who will be taking us through into a deeper dive on their thinking behind these dialogues and how non-party stakeholders can take part and participate. Now, upon the conclusion of these technical dialogues, a synthesis summary report will be produced, shown here in dark orange, and will inform the third and final component of the global stocktake, which is the consideration of outputs. Now, during this third and final phase, which again will occur at COP28 in the UAE, will include a decision or a declaration of the GST. And this decision is for parties to consider and adopt and would identify some of the opportunities and the challenges that the GST would highlight. Now, as a conclusion of this consideration of outputs series, a COP decision or a declaration could be drafted and agreed upon by parties and would mark the completion of the first global stocktake process. Now, when we think about this final output of the global stocktake, it is really meant to foster the cooperation between party and non-party stakeholders toward the Paris Agreement long-term goals, keep the political momentum, public awareness, and support for action on climate change, and most importantly, inform the next round of NDCs to ensure alignment with the goals of the Paris Agreement. This final output is arguably the most important, as it will formalize the guidance that countries adopt in order to achieve the core functions of the global stocktake. So we will be looking forward to that phase as well. If you can go to the next slide. Given how important the global stocktake process to the Paris Agreement as a whole, to the Paris Agreement mechanism as a whole, the international community, including both countries and non-party stakeholders, such as civil society, media, businesses, and others, will be heavily scrutinizing the process and its outputs. And so to ensure the effectiveness of the global stocktake process, it must be inclusive, which means that equitable participation must be ensured throughout the process. Not just that different parties from different backgrounds or different non-party stakeholders from different geographies are invited to the table, but rather that they are all actively engaged in all of the three phases of the process. An active participation of civil society and groups, especially those that are mostly affected by climate change, will be particularly important in this instance. Now, this means that there should be adequate resources available to provide developing countries, especially NGOs and other non-party stakeholders from developing countries, with the ability to meaningfully engage in making inputs, taking part in the technical dialogue, and engage on the final outcome of the global stocktake. And we will hear more from Marine from Cannes on the role of civil society and how they can actively participate in this process. Now, the second core item here is that the GST must give a complete picture of progress toward the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. This means that it provides a delicate balance of all of the issues that it must address, especially in relation to issues around equity, loss and damage, response measures, and others. And then thirdly, the process must be transparent, open. It must provide good communication throughout the 2 years in order to allow for the appropriate engagement from outside the process, from those non-party stakeholder groups, to be able to scrutinize and hold countries accountable throughout. And then finally, the process must engage with experts, scientific groups, which will allow for greater legitimacy of the global stocktake by ensuring a robust outcome that is based on the best available science. So these are I would say these are some of the main core items that need to be throughout this process, that need to be mainstreamed throughout the process, whether it's phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3. And there will be no doubt that this first exercise of the global stocktake will be essential and will set the tone for climate action in this very critical decade. So we must all take part in making sure that this process is successful and actually adheres to the core functions that it is meant to accomplish. So with that, I'll stop here and thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jamal. Really appreciate the introductory presentation, and we already have some questions, but as I mentioned earlier, we have Q&A at the end just to make sure that we have time to capture everything. So what we're going to do is just move directly on to Farhan and Harold. I'm not sure which one of you is beginning, but it's over to you now.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to the iGST for organizing this event. And I'll briefly kick off and ask Farhan to add. In Glasgow, Farhan and I met for the first time and we had a lot of informal meetings with major groups of parties and also with chairs of constituted bodies and with civil society, and many discussions in the corridors. So Jamal has actually covered quite a lot of the background, so we'll not repeat any of that, or try not to repeat any of that, but offer some insights, and I'm very happy to engage in discussion. Thanks, Jamal, for the presentation. I think some of the key words that you ended with in terms of being inclusive and comprehensive, transparent, those points were very well made. Yeah, I think I can say overall that one of Farhan and my ambitions is to keep the technical dialogue as technical as possible. So we really want to enable a dialogue that is that is technical in nature, that brings in all the inputs that you mentioned, but that also is really generative. And in that respect, what happens inside the formal process, the formal global stocktake, we co-facilitating just the technical dialogue component, and what happens outside are both really very important. And so it's great to have the iGST network and many people, and it's very good to see so many people on this call. So just a couple of things. I think Jamal mentioned this, but just to emphasize that there is a call for inputs already. This was issued by the SP chairs. So the division of labor is that the SP chairs, Marianne and Tosi, organize the entire global stocktake. We conduct the technical dialogue, but the call for inputs was made, in fact, already before Glasgow. The February deadline, which some of you may be struggling with, we disclaim all responsibility for that. That was a decision in Katowice. No, we don't, but it is serious. We need that information, but it's 3 months before. So decision 19 CMA1 is said 3 months before the technical dialogue. And just as a practical matter, of course, it's a very complex exercise to design the process of this dialogue, look through the large volume of inputs that we expect. We certainly know that the IPCC reports are all fat things like these, and put that all together. And so time is needed to prepare for that. But also would say that it is 3 months before each technical dialogue session. So again, 3 months before the COP in Egypt. I was working it out the other day, but I've instantly forgotten the date, but I think it's somewhere in July. What we're saying in relation to that, to everyone, and whether these are inputs from parties or experts or non-party stakeholders or anybody at all, is that there's a long list of sources of input in the decision. We're saying, give us an input now, frame, the key issues that you see, tell us what you're going to say, rather don't give us entirely new inputs every time, right? We want to construct a dialogue that will continue over time. And so while February is now, end of February is now very soon, we would really encourage everyone to get in, even if you add later. Jamal mentioned the 13 synthesis reports. Those are one of the sources of input. So obviously, reports and communications from parties, the IPCC reports, and the synthesis reports. Of those, there are 4 that are specifically being prepared. Well, they all get prepared by the Secretariat. I think you understand how this works, but 4 of them are prepared under the guidance of the co-facilitators. In other words, Fine and myself, and we are actively working with the Secretariat on those. And then the other ones are from the constitutors bodies, forums, and institutional arrangements. So from the adaptation committee to the MXCOM to the forum on implementation of response measures. I can't get them all together, but they're in a footnote somewhere, right? They are all, and we are expecting synthesis reports from all of those. The 4 being prepared under our guidance relate to greenhouse gas inventories and emissions, to adaptation, to NDCs, and to means of implementation and support. And so that's something we think, of course, that those are also important inputs, but there's a very wide range of inputs. One thing I briefly wanted to just one thing I wanted to mention in terms of making inputs. We have realized that it hasn't been entirely clear. The mechanics of making the input have not been entirely clear. There is if you go to the GST website, you will now see a guide on how to make inputs, which Paloma from the Secretariat, I think I saw her in the audience, so thank Paloma for colleagues for the efforts in making that clearer, and hopefully it is now clear how you get it up there. And then the last thing I want to touch on before asking Farhan to add some thoughts is just how this network of the iGST could engage in the technical dialogue. Obviously, the written inputs, which I've just mentioned. It's also, as you're doing right now, so convening meetings, it's great. So I mean, Fine and I are 2 people. There's a small team supporting us in the Secretariat, and we will not convene a whole lot of preparatory meetings other than the regional climate weeks, which the Secretariat organizes, and those will include for some discussion of the global stocktake. But this network or research alliances, can convene, and generally what we are saying is we can't organize it, we encourage those, and we would like to know about them. It will also, but it's certainly something also that iGST and its members can do. We think of the technical dialogues as a conversation of 3 kinds of people, as it were. Parties, experts, and non-party stakeholders. That's pretty much given in the mandate. And on experts, iGST as many experts. Once we're clearer and we are still thinking, a lot of our answers to questions that you might have will be, we are still thinking, but we will invite some experts to inform what we hope will really be a technical dialogue. Also, something is, we don't just want answers, at least at this stage, before the first technical dialogue. Problem statements or framing statements are also fine. We think that the technical dialogue should tackle some of the really difficult issues that have, because we are in a space that is not a text-based negotiation, it's not a political space in that sense. The joint contact group will do the politics. We want to, we also want to have inputs in that way, but of course you will understand that we can't have, if we have all experts in the same meeting, that would be pandemonium. So that will be by invitation. We will, the other challenge, and this will be my last point, I think, is that in taking on this role, is that this will be an exercise in synthesis of synthesis, right? At the end, as Jamal was describing, after the third technical dialogue, after the first two technical dialogues, there will be summary reports that Fine and I will prepare, as I say, on our responsibility. And then a factual synthesis report, which is really the piece that passes from the technical dialogue to the political phase, the consideration of outputs. And that, what is in that, of course, is important and matters, but it's from a very large volume of inputs that we have already seen and expect further. So Farhan, please add and complement.
Yeah, no, thank you, Harold, for that summary, and also Jamal for covering a lot of the nuts and bolts, and also laying out a really clear vision for the important elements of the global stocktake. Certainly all of those issues you highlighted in your last slide are issues that Harold and I have been discussing, and we'll be happy to hear more views from the participants in terms of if they have thoughts on any of those issues. As Harold mentioned, we are in the midst of preparing for the first technical dialogue session at the June SB sessions in Bonn. And as you pointed out, there'll be 3 of these sessions over the course of the next year. One in November and another one the following June in 2023. It's going to be a pretty intense process, as Harold just highlighted, in terms of the amount of topics and amount of information we're expecting to come in, and have a thorough discussion between parties, experts, and non-party stakeholders. It'll be a challenge to make sure that we are able to treat all of the themes of the global stocktake fully and comprehensively, in terms of making sure that all of the important issues are being discussed. And as Harold mentioned, some of the difficult issues that oftentimes may not get as much attention in the political negotiations, that maybe there's some issues that we could discuss in this technical forum, and build some broad consensus in terms of how those issues can be discussed going forward. We at this stage, as Harold mentioned, we're still in a relatively early stage in terms of our planning. We're actively doing it, but we're at an early stage to share sort of final plans for June. But we just wanted to highlight that we will be issuing a note, hopefully in the early May, late April timeframe, that would lay out sort of the views of the arrangements for the session, so that people are able to prepare. And just to add one thing to Harold's point about the website, my understanding is that as inputs come in to the Secretariat, they will be posted on a single page. So hopefully we will have a single portal where participants are able to go to find written inputs from the list of organizations that could be providing inputs in one common place. And so I think that'll be a helpful bit of infrastructure for our discussion, so that people are able to read inputs and have some general knowledge going into the discussions that we have at the sessions. There's just to share a little bit of informal considerations that we're talking about. And this is a lot of the issues that we were raising with parties on the margins of COP26. is the question of, you could see the dialogue proceeding in various ways, right? You could have rooms where you have a panel of experts and on a stage, and they give their 15-20 minute presentations, and every so often we pause and get questions and answers from the audience to the presenters. Certainly a model that's being used many times in the framework convention and elsewhere in these sort of sessions. For us, thinking about that, it's helpful in order to have a single conversation that everyone is participating in, everyone understands exactly what's happening and what points were being raised. But unfortunately, there's only one conversation happening, and it's fairly limited in terms of the dynamics between the participants and the presenters. On the other end of the spectrum could be something like a poster session where you have a number of presenters from a wide variety of organizations, in a large room presenting on a particular topic, and you have participants sort of going around and having one-on-one conversations with the presenters, which could be very generative in terms of allowing a lot of interesting discussion, but of course capturing that and building off of that in terms of outcomes is very difficult, because there's so many conversations being had that it's difficult for us to capture all of the richness of the discussion. So Harold and I are thinking about how do we proceed with discussions that sort of bridge those discussions, have space for both the broader discussions as well as some of the more detailed individual discussions that are important, and how do we make sure that we're capturing all of that together. So we're in the process now of sort of both thinking through the right arrangements there, and of course I don't need to tell anyone that the restrictions with COVID-19 and understanding how the sessions will be run, how people can fit into a single room, practical matters such as that, but also in terms of the thematic areas and making sure that we have the right experts in the room are all things that we're actively being considering and discussing between Harold and I and the Secretariat and the subsidiary body chairs and everyone else who's involved in the planning of this session. And then the other major sort of point of consideration that we are discussing now is just sort of, how do we develop a process that doesn't result in 3 separate dialogues happening over the course of the year of dialogues, or is it how do we build something that has a narrative that can build upon itself in each of the sessions. So by the time we're at the 3rd session in 2023, we're really building off of all the discussions we've had in the previous 2 sessions, and not just starting back up with the very basics and and considering the inputs that have come in, but really sort of building off what we've discussed. And I think there's it'd be interesting to hear if others have views in terms of the what role could processes like the iGST and others that could have intersessional discussions have and sort of bridging discussions between sessions. But that's certainly something that we're thinking about in terms of how do we promote a discussion that builds upon itself across the 3 sessions. I'll leave it there and happy to answer questions about the process that we're laying out here. And as Harold said, there's still a lot that we're still in discussion, so maybe we will have to defer specific answers to some of the questions, but be happy to take back any comments you have now and include them in our considerations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Harold. Thank you, Farhan. And we do have questions coming in, but what we're going to do is move on to Maureen, and then any questions that haven't already been answered by text or which you didn't like the answer and you want to re-up the question, then we'll try to get to those during the Q&A. The Q&A is going to function solely on the basis of the written Q&A. So that's how we're going to determine what goes to the panelists. So if you have a question for the Q&A, you're going to have to write it down, and please do use the Q&A, not the chat function. It's just easier to keep track. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen Pouget from Climate Action Network.
Thank you, and hello everyone. My name is Marine, and I am working for the Climate Action Network in France on global climate governance, and I am also one of the coordinator of the CAN International Working Group on the Global Stocktake. And I'm very happy to join you today. And I will just add a few perspectives from the civil society on the Global Stocktake, although quite a lot of things have been said already. So it's more our own perspectives and our own words, but you will see there is quite a lot of synergies there. So I guess for us NGOs, the Global Stocktake is a bit like the guardian of the Paris Agreement, because this is the evaluation mechanism that will make the tracking of the progress or lack of progress. And it means it is about respecting the Paris goals, which means limit the global warming as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. And this means if you start to see the consequences, it means to protect our biodiversity. It means save human lives, but also livelihoods and culture. And so for us, it has a real kind of guardian role that is extremely important. And before I go for our key success factors, I would like to present you 6 key principles we developed last year that we could present in the COP26 to the co-facilitators, but also to the parties mostly. So for us, the Global Stocktake is the one, as I said, who has to make Paris happen. So it means ambition and really try to foster ambition for 1.5. So this is basically the vision of the Global Stocktake for us. But then there are a few other principles I wanted to share with you. As it was said, I saw in the questions, the Global Stocktake can't happen if there is no inclusion, and especially of indigenous people's knowledge, which is unique and should be reflected. And this is one of the key principles making that possible. The third one would be assess the implementation of the Paris Agreement according to human rights, respect and protection. So just be sure that we do not foster a transition that is not just and that is not respecting human rights, but also indigenous people's rights. Then the next principle would be, next to assessing what has been done and where we are now, we think there is a very important pillar, which is assess the damages and the impacts, because as you all know, the climate change is already happening, and we have a lot of countries who are already extremely in danger, and their population are in danger. And because, as I said, it's about people, we think this is really a key corner, a keystone of the Global Stocktake. Then next to the damages that we are already confronted to, especially the Global South, so there is the equity question there as well. There is also assessing the protection of ecosystems. I know, or you all know probably also, that climate and biodiversities are not exactly in the same framework. And this is where it's a bit sad, because we should be ambitious for the two agendas, right? So maybe the Global Stocktake is the moment where inside the UNFCCC we could also talk about biodiversity, because tackling climate change can't happen without protection of biodiversity. And the last principle I wanted to share was be sure that next to saying what has been done and where we are going, so this looking forward and solutions provider from the Global Stocktake, there is also assessing the phase out of fossil fuels very specifically, that we think is important, because this is a kind of this is essential just to implement the Paris Agreement. So next to what has been done and what could be done and what are the alternatives, there is also assessing what should not be done, or at least be sure that we are going in this good direction. And now the 3 pillars where we think these are key to a successful GST, and this is where the Climate Action Network will engage this year and the one after, of course. So the first thing, which is for us key, and it has been said by Jamal as well at the beginning, is the technical and financial support for developing countries to be able to participate in the Global Stocktake. Because as you know, it's a lot of technicality, it's a language thing, it's a reporting, lack of reporting measures or tools. And all of this is key to be able to be part of the Global Stocktake, right? So this is something we talked about with parties during the COP26, and we did not receive so much answer now on how this can be supported. So I guess this is a key element of our advocacy and communication work for this year. This is also concerning constituencies such as indigenous peoples, communities and representatives, NGOs, and others who want to engage but who need support for that. The second pillar then is what we call our advocacy pillar. So it means really engage in the process. We think a global stocktake can't be successful if it's without participation, and this is in its core. Like this is really I think this is really understood for everyone, and all parties are also underlining that it's important to have non-state actors there, especially maybe from the constituencies, at least from the UNFCCC. So we would contribute to the information and the information collection, and preparation components. So we will be submitting all the contributions that we can. We will try to show gaps, but also solutions and how to move forward. We will also engage in the workshops, technical dialogues, and try really to bring people's voices in the Global Stocktake. And we think this is this core element of the second pillar. And with that, we will do it as NGOs, but we will try to coordinate with other constituencies so that we have also people talking about their solutions or the impacts they are feeling inside the Global Stocktake. And to finish, we have our bottom-up mobilization pillar, which is more outside of the official process and actually leveraging the Global Stocktake as a political process, really a series of moments where really ambition is called and there is an impact on the ambitions of the parties. And we would like to have a GST that is complete, and for that should be technical, but we want a GST that everyone feels concerned about. And so we are thinking about a bottom-up public participation strategy. We just talked about the climate weeks, but there are also other tools we could use that we have already in our network. Maybe have a campaign, try to get out of the UNFCCC sphere and have other people interested, and try to transfer their key messages inside the Global Stocktake process and vice versa. So yeah, I hope it was not too long. It was just a few thoughts from my perspective, and I would be very happy to discuss further with you, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maïm. And that's the final presentation. So we do now have 14 minutes by my clock to address some of the questions that have been put into the Q&A. A number of them have already been answered. And again, if you don't feel like the answer was clear or adequate, whatever you might say, feel free to ask it again. Just in terms of the iGST as such, and I did include one response there about the membership of the iGST. I would also respond to questions around things like, how do you address equity in the design of the Paris Agreement and in the stocktake? Well, this is one reason why we have an equity working group, which has done a super job putting together thoughts about how precisely that would be defined. And it's exactly why independent thought on this is really helpful, because it's very tricky, and yet they've come up with some excellent concrete suggestions. Similarly, around finance and definitions of financial flows, or in the case of adaptation, the adaptation working group is focusing more specifically on the role of non-state, i.e. business actors, who are important in a lot of national contexts. So I encourage you to look at what we have on the website, and also to get in touch around some specific issues that you might have. I'm therefore going to turn to the questions that we have in the Q&A in the order that we have them, and for which I haven't seen any answers. The first one has to do with, are we basically assessing conditional or unconditional NDCs? And I see Hannah's starting to throw up an answer to that. Perhaps it's already done. Whoops, it's moving along as we discuss it. Sorry, go ahead,
pushing
Hannah.
it forward. So I was just pushing it forward so everybody can read it in their Q&A box.
Oh, okay. So these aren't visible to everybody?
Not yet, but I'll push
Okay,
it
all
forward.
right. So that's the first one. And I would then just invite, if any of the panelists want to talk about that question, as I know it's a little bit, it's kind of a complicated, long question. So which I can no longer see, but nevertheless, it has to do with the question of whether or not the assessment of the stocktake will be conditional or unconditional NDCs, given their importance, conditionality to
Jason, I'm happy to give a brief and probably unsatisfactory answer to that detailed question from Kamal. I mean, at one level, as Kamal, you know well, right? So the transparency framework, the Global Stocktakers Collective, and it would be the enhanced transparency framework that would assess, NDCs at an individual level. But also from the IPCC's perspective, there's certainly analysis at the global level of whether there's an emissions gap, for example, whether from conditional or unconditional NDC. So in the sixth assessment report, and I know you're also an author on that, there would be information in relation to both, and that would then of course mean that then also creates the link to support, which is whether the conditions have been met, which is I think is partly what you're raising. But yeah, we will certainly not go into individual NDCs and whether conditional or unconditional, but at that collective level, I think. And then also points to there's also an implementation gap, which itself is complex, and that partly depends on whether conditions have been met or not.
And I think this question may have popped in when either you, Harold, or Fahan were speaking about the CMA decisions, that one of the panelists said that civil society can comment on them. So do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, I think that's a misunderstanding or misspeaking. Sorry, you cannot comment on decisions. Only the COP or CMA can change a decision once it's agreed.
Yeah, okay. I'm trying to interpret this next one. In the technical assessment and consideration of outputs, how would it look if parties are held to account effectively on their collective progress, which I'm interpreting to mean one of the basic kind of difficulties of this exercise is, if it's collective, how do you actually hold a party to account? And indeed, how useful is it to parties in determining their next NDCs, et cetera, as a collective exercise? So this issue of collectivity versus individual usefulness seems to be one of the kind of basic questions around the stocktake, if any panelist wants to take that up. And if you do, just feel free to chime in. Mariam?
Yeah, thanks. I would just have a few thoughts on this. I mean, that's where we have to think as a global process, how could we a bit split the work? And this is where, for example, we see a lot of synergies with what civil society is doing, trying to get from the global information, global trends, try to translate that in some very concrete assessment at the national level or regional, and try then to reach out to parties and explain, okay, this is what is your part inside of that, and how could you maybe improve or continue the way you are doing. So we can't do this work alone, of course, but I think there is a part of the civil society there that should be played. And this is also probably where we would need some or also the developing countries, mostly from the global south, would need a bit more support as well. I mean, if there is the part of how do we know who is doing what exactly and who's part in there, and also then how do we help the ones who wants to improve, and how they can analyze that kind of statements and analysis. So I guess that's the only answer I have for the moment. There are still a lot of things to figure out with the GST, but I guess one part of our work from 2023, 2024 would be to translate the outputs at the national level.
Farhan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, thanks. And thanks, Maureen, for that answer too. And just to build off that too, and I think it's important perspective to have at this stage as well, is just to highlight that this is the first global stock take, and it's a 2-year process that we're undergoing now, and that means that in every next stock take is every 5 years. So it's really there's not a lot of time between each global stock take, and so this question of individual country sort of responses and sort of how will they be taken into account, I think it's we always need to zoom out a little bit beyond just this particular global stock take and look at the whole overall process in terms of in 2025, what we're expecting this process, or sorry, in 2023, when we expect this process to end, that will inform NDCs that are coming out in the coming years, and right before the next assessment will come forward. And so, this global stock take is somewhat unique in that it doesn't have the full information from the biennial transparency reports that we would expect to start being delivered in 2024, and other sort of aspects I think are key elements to the overall ambition cycle of the Paris Agreement. So just to highlight that, I think this global stock take will be somewhat unique in that it's the first time we're doing this. It's going to be sort of a lot of, I think, baseline setting in terms of sort of where we are right now in terms of collective progress. And I think hopefully in future global stock takes, as we get updated NDCs, more information via the transparency reporting, that we will have a better understanding of sort of where things aligned and misaligned in terms of the Paris Agreement goals going forward. So just to highlight that sort of aspect of timing here and where we are in the sort of establishment of the whole Paris Agreement process.
Would you say, Farhan, or anybody else, that similar answer to the question about the IPCC synthesis report? Not everything is going to line up this first time, but maybe things will find their way into the process thereafter. Yeah, I see some nodding. Unless there's something specific.
I can come back quick.
Yeah,
I can come back quickly on the census report question. I mean, so as we highlighted, so it's kind of interesting that the input collection phase of the global stock take, started in COP26, so last November, and it will run all the way through the third session of the technical dialogue, so which is June next year. So we will certainly plan to incorporate input from the synthesis report into future sessions of the stock take, just as we will incorporate any other emerging information as it comes out during this technical dialogue process, noting, of course, the constraints that we have in terms of time and making sure that we're able to build a sort of a cohesive discussion across the sessions. But emerging information, I think, will hopefully be able to be adopted into the process.
Yeah. We had an attendee who was having trouble typing in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read out what I've got from the chat, which is, I think, a really useful one for a lot of people who may be listening in, which is about the way civil society can make most efficient use of the submissions that are available to them. You, and I think this is primarily Farhan and Harold, but have highlighted it would be helpful to formulate problem statements. So what kinds of submissions or problem statements are you looking for? What's going to be helpful given the volume of potential inputs? What should a civil society organization aim to do in their submission that will be most useful in the process?
I'll hazard a guess, and Farhan may have a different example, but one of the questions was alluding to this, right? So if you could really make a breakthrough on finance, right, we know many other things could follow, right? It's finance not the only means of implementation or support, but it's an important one. And yet there are almost two worldviews, right? Of there's actually literature on this, right? Of those who sort of on the 2.1c financial flows, a lot of them at the domestic level, a lot of them, the bigger ones private, and those who on the Article 9 world where there are obligations continued under the Paris Agreement of developed countries to provide finance as an obligation, mostly public grants, right? How do you construct a conversation? And I think well, I know that the finance working group of the iGST has been thinking about this kind of thing. So how do we, that's a problem or framing statement. Someone who pointed out that problem statement may be somewhat negative. Of course, we want better solutions and more climate action at the end of the entire global stocktake. But that's just, where are the, where do you see the really difficult issues that in this kind of a process may be able to resolve? Also understanding, I think the equity questions raise this very, very well, right? There may be questions that are not best addressed amongst parties, and that will only go so far amongst, or not amongst parties, but even amongst parties, expert and non-party stakeholders. We know that there's been a civil society equity review for many years that can say things that would not be said in the WCCB. Put them out there and tell us what you think. If we answered the following question, if we addressed the following problem statement, that would really make a difference. We would like to know about that. And of course, yes, to read the guiding questions by the SB chairs. They keep us to what we absolutely have to address.
So we only really have a minute left. And so I don't want to, I'm going to encourage the panelists to type furiously any answers that they can get in. I don't want to open the floor for more responses because we don't really have time to do them, but I'm going to stretch this minute for as long as the 60 seconds will allow us, and use it to profusely thank our panelists and all of the attendees. Thank you so much to Jamal Suruji from World Resources Institute, Harold Winkler and Farhan Akhtar, who are the technical dialogue co-chairs, to Marine Pouget from Climate Action Network. I would also point out that we have my colleagues at ClimateWorks, Hannah and Josefina, who are visible to you, I believe. And we're also joined by Casey in being the secretariat for this. So please do contact us via the emails that you will have gotten to invite you to this, or through the website with any other questions. As you can imagine, anybody who's working on the stocktake for as long as we have are absolutely super excited to see this many people who wanted to know more about this. And so really encourage you to get in touch so that we can have the opportunity to engage with you in this coming period, which is going to be obviously even more important and exciting in the life cycle of this process.